In Hollywood, new revelations about have surfaced showing his Studio One company knew for at least 2 years that he'd been paying off women who accused him of sexual harassment and assault. Has been fired from the company as a slew of women have come forward to accuse him of sexual harassment.
So much of the power of reporting on MeToo cases comes from the fact that when someone powerful has been exposed, more people come forward, public opinion changes, and they go down. So you can imagine what an impediment it would be to that development if you weren't allowed to feature the names or faces of the people being accused in news stories or publications. Or if you couldn't run a story because the evidence against the accused was so great. Well, that's the reality in Germany. I want to tell you about a doctor. In 1983 in Berlin, the first 2 HIV cases were reported. This freaked out the public. And this being a brand new disease that seemed to only affect gay people, a lot of doctors didn't want to deal with people who had it. By 1992, 9,000 people in Berlin had HIV, and there were still only a few doctors with the will and the expertise to treat them. So in 1994, a doctor comes along and opens an HIV clinic. Our doctor is gay himself and had a non-judgmental approach to treatment. The clinic was open 7 days a week and treated people even without insurance. So he became the guy to go to. As the doctor was ascending in prominence in Germany and internationally, it kind of became an open secret that he maybe sexually assaults a lot of his patients. So in 2002, 8 years after he opened his clinic, what is essentially the German medical board started looking into him. But it wasn't until 2012, 18 years after his clinic opened, that an official investigation was opened. Unfortunately, the investigation would close essentially with the promise from the doctor to change and be better. Obviously, this was meaningless. The old behavior was likely to continue. And he would end up with new patients who were totally unaware of his record. But in 2016, another charge was filed, this time from the public prosecutor on behalf of 5 victims. The charges had to be kept from the public, which obviously means that new patients who otherwise definitely would have canceled their appointments would keep showing up. But still, it's something. But at this point, our doctors had 20 years to accumulate money and power and a really litigious lawyer. So that, along with a couple other complications, including the pandemic, the 2016 case won't be heard until April of this year. So first, you definitely wouldn't go to this guy, and you wouldn't necessarily know not to go to this guy because you don't know his name. And if you go searching for articles about it, you get things like this in an article in Der Tagesspiegel, in which they give you his biography, but never say the doctor's name. And the comments are also oddly self-censored. I think many of you probably know which doctor it is, and I only know the aforementioned Mr. J is slimy and unappealing to me. Only one visit to the doctor and I knew I needed another. So why does it seem like the only way to know about this doctor who's been abusing his patients for 25 years is through word of mouth? You see, Germany has these privacy laws in their constitution, and the laws themselves are pretty innocuous. They are: human dignity shall be inviolable, to respect and protect it shall be the duty of all state authority, and every person shall have the right to free development of his personality insofar as he does not violate the rights of others or offend against the constitutional order or moral law. A couple other lines too, but this is all we need for our purposes. These are the first 2 articles in the Constitution, and of course, who could argue with them? They're fine. But the way they're understood and implemented is different. That was developed in 1954 by the German equivalent to the Supreme Court. Essentially, the interpretation is this: there are 3 personal spheres: individual, private, and intimate. Each one protects certain privacies, including against defamation, because one of the goals of these laws is to guarantee informational self-determination, which defamation would violate. One is supposed to be able to freely develop their own character, right? So Andrew Cuomo, for example, has technically been stripped of his right to informational self-determination because it obviously wasn't his intention to become known as a sexual predator, even though he's fucking guilty. And since he hasn't actually been convicted of anything yet, the media has aided in violating his fears of privacy. Printing someone's name in relation to sexual assault would violate their intimate sphere. Now, you could do this if it's in the public's interest. However, you may have to go out of your way to balance the coverage so as not to essentially illustrate guilt. But how do you do that when you have a glut of evidence all pointing to guilt? So theoretically, if this were Germany, Andrew Cuomo could sue every network who's reported these allegations for defamation. But theoretically, in Germany, the allegations against Cuomo might never even make it as far as they've gotten. Now, there are some legal exceptions to these rules when it comes to public figures and the public's interest, but it's still much harder to address these issues in the media in Germany than in the US.
But only after that second step.
So the story of our doctor was being investigated by BuzzFeed and Vice, and they wanted to disclose the doctor's first name and last initial in the report, Heiko J. This would obviously be enough to identify him. So, first article was published, and within a week, a complaint was filed. So, this went to court, and judges ultimately ruled that they couldn't run the story because there was so much evidence and so much detail in it that there was no way to read the story and see innocence as a possibility. That to me doesn't sound like a reason not to run a story, but they had to take the story down. Now, BuzzFeed and Vice did file an appeal, but more on that later. Now, this investigation was sparked by a man's Facebook post in which, just like the comments in the Der Tagesspiegel article, he didn't mention the doctor's name, but obviously alleged sexual abuse. So the doctor sued this guy for defamation and won. The man who made the Facebook post had to pay out 3,000 euros for his and the doctor's court fees. Now think about that, 3,000 euros over a Facebook post that didn't even mention a name, which is Heiko Jessen, by the way. So defamation in Germany is serious, but there aren't as many defamation cases as there are criminal insult cases. And a criminal insult is exactly what it sounds like, a written or verbal insult that can literally be criminally pursued. Now think about something. If you were writing a novel, think about how oppressive a universe you'd be trying to construct by making something like calling a cop a pig, punishable by 6 months in jail. But that story has already been written, and it's called Germany Right Now. In 2017, there was a man who was stopped by the cops for an alcohol and drug check. This man is referred to in this article as Y for the previously mentioned reasons. Turns out Y was generally distrustful of the police. So when the police engaged him, he started recording audio on his phone. As soon as the cops left, he uploaded the recording to Dropbox, which was smart because, as it turns out, the cops ended up accusing him of calling them names. But the man thought to record the event. This would obviously prove that even if he had been rude, he hadn't insulted them. The cops claimed he insulted them over 20 times. Obviously not. No insults are on the recording. Case closed. But what if, in the 4 minutes between ending the recording and uploading it to Dropbox, he edited out all the insults? This was the prosecution's argument. Now, anyone who's edited a text message on their phone knows that this is probably an impossible timeline. Nevertheless, they invite an expert to give their professional opinion. Obviously, he says no, it's not possible. So at this point, it's time for the judge to take into consideration every asinine feature of this stupid case and, hopefully, dismiss it. So what does the judge rule? Well, he decides that the man referred to as Y, in fact, engineered this entire event to make the cops appear guilty and ruin their careers. This guy went out of his way to go through a drug and alcohol checkpoint to destroy cops he's never met. The judge determined the man baited the cops with insults and then, despite expert opinion, edited them out of the recording. 6 months in jail. Horrifying. Now, the author of the article claims that this is atypical, but in 2013, German courts heard 26,000 criminal insult cases, and 20,000 of which resulted in fines. And if you're wondering if this psychotic and juvenile criminalization of name-calling extends to online, it does. My good friend Jeremy Osborne, who you've already seen, and is really responsible for a huge portion of the research in this video, he lives in Berlin and had his own incident.
So I had a really bad tax preparer, and it took like 4.5 months to do my taxes for like 2016, and then for 2017, it was like 3 months. And I went there when I called to complain. This woman was really rude, the secretary, so I hung up on her, and I went over there and had this really big confrontation with the secretary who I thought was an idiot. And she shoved me, because I was arguing with her. She shoves me and then runs to the other room with the tax preparers. And finally, they explained to me what's going on. Oh, we work on these things as we get them. We're sorry. And I wrote a bad review because it was a bad experience. So this woman shoved me. I said I think she was racist, et cetera, et cetera. Then about 5 months later, I got a letter in the mail telling me that I've been charged or was being investigated for defamation and that I didn't leave the building fast enough. She asked me to leave and I didn't leave. So that's like, I don't know, disorderly conduct, some bogus charge. They had to go to a lawyer. And I mean, it was thrown out in the end. But from the time, that case, it just dragged on. I got the letter from the police in April of 2019, and it was thrown out in January 2020. In the meantime, you can't do things like you can't go and get a renewal of your visa because you have a criminal case pending. That stuff, it's really detrimental to your life and job prospects, etc.
You couldn't get a visa because you wrote a negative Google review.
You are correct.
Now, it should also be noted that insult laws are controversial. The Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which Germany is a part, says that the use of insult laws constitutes an infringement on the fundamental right to free speech. Because after all, an insult usually illustrates an opinion and is thus distinct from defamation. And not only does it attenuate free speech, these insult laws, it's also arrestingly stupid. In 2004, Michael Naumann, owner of the newspaper Die Zeit, was convicted of insult and fined 9,000 euros for calling the Attorney General of Berlin basically crazy. It was 5 years before he was finally acquitted by the Supreme Court. And as for our Dr. Heiko Jessen, at the end of 2020, BuzzFeed and Vice went back to court to win the right to run the story. Fortunately, they had a slightly more sympathetic judge, but only slightly. In December of 2020, they were finally granted the right to run the story, but under the condition that they make it appear as if innocence was in the cards, which more than likely means deleting a lot of granularity in the victims' stories and ultimately omitting evidence. Right now, when you look for the articles, this is what comes up. Due to a legal dispute, this article is not available until further notice. Now, the story of Dr. Heiko Jessen, I should say, I'm really lifting from a piece by Caitlin L. Chandler in the Columbia Journalism Review. I'd recommend everyone go and read that. But as far as the BuzzFeed Vice investigation goes, what it'll look like when and if it finally gets published, we don't know. But the damage was already accomplished. For the victims, especially, and for journalism, the formal censorship baked into this interpretation of the law, which makes defamation suits so easy, is flack. And just like in America, flack doesn't kill journalism completely, but it makes people think really hard about how badly they want to pursue certain topics, and obviously this permeates into a culture. And it's not necessarily by design. Most people act out of self-interest, right? No one's thinking long-term about how to inoculate sexual predators against journalists. But the net effect is that the next person who wants to divulge their story on Facebook or write about a story in BuzzFeed or Die Zeit or wherever will definitely think twice. So I hope you like this brief look into some of the more ridiculous and oppressive aspects of Germany's legal system. If you did, if you feel like you learned something, subscribe. It helps other people find this. If you'd like to support what I'm doing and get access to some bonus content, you can support me on Patreon. And I'll see you in the next one.